Today's program is Under Steam. Our presenter is Ian Clark. He's a steam train enthusiast and a professional photographer. He has traveled the world to take photographs of working steam train engines. Steam locomotives were once more common than automobiles, but they have become nearly extinct. Only about 210 steam engines remain capable of pulling trains in the United States, and he has photographed over 130 of them under steam. He has visited museums and gone on steam train excursions. Today he'll share images of 64 locomotives with 34 railroads in 19 states. And he'll give us an explanation of the various wheel arrangements and locomotive configurations to give us a better understanding of steam engines. Ian spent 20 years owning or managing commercial photo labs around the U.S. He was the manager of NASA's photographic section at the Langley Research Center. For fun, he figured out how much film he must have processed over the years. Listen to these totals: over 10,000 miles of E6 slide film, several thousand miles of color negative film, news film, black and white film, and when printing photos, he has used over 600 acres of paper. Then he decided to switch from processing the photos to creating them. Thus, his travels to follow his passion of steam trains. He also devotes time to nature photography. He spent a whole season following a loon family from mating, hatching, and rearing their young. We'll invite him back to do a program on that one for us. He lives in West Newbury, Vermont, where he photographs sports and other events for the local paper. He is a juried member of the New Hampshire Guild of Craftsmen. Bruce and I saw him at the Sunapee Craft Fair last summer. And as we marveled at his photographs and listened to his stories, I kept thinking, what a great program this would be for our OLLI group. So I asked him and he said, yes, I'd love to come and share my photographs and information with you. Please welcome Ian Clark.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, Marita was kind enough to give me my choice of the first or second program for the season. And hearing that you've got Raptors coming in 2 weeks, I'm glad I took the first one. Never follow an animal act. Never follow. And let's see, you know, we talked for 3 or 4 minutes at the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen Fair. Let's see if I can entertain you for a whole hour. But oh, we've got the story of a hobby that grew out of control in, probably as early as late grade school. My father tried to interest me in photography. He'd been a lifelong amateur photographer. And my brother and I had a model railroad going in the basement, and it was pretty quick when I found myself out. I grew up along the Boston and Maine out in West Acton, Mass. And there was a freight yard out in Air, Mass, just to the west of us. And I misspent a lot of my school years in high school instead of out in the yard in Air. Oh, maybe that was back. Parents would have said that was backwards, but I spent a lot of time in Air, and that was back in the days when you could walk up into the tower and talk with the fellow that was throwing the switches and sorting the trains, and you could get away with that and get the occasional cab ride in the locomotives. And it was a different world. It was retail. They'd deliver a boxcar or two. Now the freight business has pretty much gone to trains. You fill a train and the railroad runs an entire train for you. If you go out on the West Coast, I like to go out. The Mojave Desert's a neat place in the spring when it's in bloom. And traffic builds over the week. At the end of the week, you get like 110 trains a day going across the Mojave Desert. And you can always tell when a ship has gotten unloaded in the LA ports, because you get a train of containers headed for Huntsville, Alabama, followed by another one for Dallas, followed by one for Chicago, followed by, but the diesels are interesting, but my real passion has turned into steam locomotives. I was born just too late. The books will tell you that the last mainline steam operation in the U.S. was in July 20, 1960. I was born in July '61. I suspect that somewhere unrecorded, some train master needed to move a train, and he had a steam locomotive, and his diesel wouldn't start. So probably the last mainline steam run was in my lifetime, but just barely. So what you're going to see is a lot of museum pieces. What we're going to do, I'll start with explaining a real quick explanation of wheel arrangements and names, and give you some idea how to guess what a locomotive was designed to do looking at it. Now, I'm a photographer, sort of a technical photographer, but I'm not an engineer, not railroad or civil or mechanical, and to Dad's great dismay, not even electrical. So, if I say something and you know it's wrong, don't throw things at me. So we'll start on the West Coast and look at locomotives coming across the country. For them to count in the total of the ones that I've photographed, they have to be fired up. They have to have a fire, and they have to be producing steam and pushing or pulling something. So I've got lots more that are stuffed and mounted in parks. Those don't count. So we'll look at a bunch. We'll hop across the country fairly quickly to get you at it. I've got something like 480,000 images of trains at this point. My wife says you probably don't want to see all of them, but we will stop and take a longer look at 3 railroads as we go across the country. The Nevada Northern Railway Museum, which was a copper mining railroad in Ely, Nevada, that after World War II, when the price of copper came down, they said, okay, we're going to pack up the railroad and wait until the price of copper comes back up. So they expected to run again, and they took all the equipment indoors and oiled and lubed and did all the repairs they needed and packed it away to sit. The price of copper never came back up high enough to run it again, but the town came up on a centennial or some anniversary. They said, wouldn't it be neat if the train ran again? So the train started running, and it got enough attention, so they ran it again, and somebody said, well, let's make a museum. And so we'll stop and look at them. The next one we'll stop and take a longer look at is the East Broad Top down in Orbosonia, Pennsylvania. We got a EBT fan. The East Broad Top was a narrow gauge, 2-foot wide rails down just south of the Pennsylvania Railroad main line, and after World War II again, the economics got it so it wasn't worth running, and they parked everything and sold the railroad lock, stock, and barrel to a scrapper. And the scrapper never got around to scrapping it. Once again, the town came up on an anniversary, and somebody said, wouldn't it be neat if the train ran again? And so the train ran again, and once again, it got enough attention. And this has been a railroad that several groups struggled to run it. They'd get it going, but as time went by, the capital needed to do the repairs just ate up you couldn't keep it going. So it got to be sort of a joke amongst the rail fan community that, how many times have you been to the very last run of the East Broad Top? I think I got 8. But 2 years ago, a pair of retired railroaders with money have bought the place, and they are restoring it and doing a phenomenal job. Those will be the latest images we saw. I was down in October. The last railroad we'll stop and take a look at is up in Alma, Maine, the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington, where there are a bunch of fanatical guys doing an amazing job with a little 2-foot railroad in Maine. Let's okay. This is like a quest. It's a hobby that grew out of control. The same thing happened with the loons. I've actually been following them for 11 years now and have 300,000 pictures of loons. But yeah, you can see I get a little obsessive. It's my goals when I'm out there. I want to create realistic scenes that might have been. Okay? No modern automobiles. No cell phone towers. Those are a killer these days. And we have gone so far as to haul down the 50-star flag to run up a 48-star flag. I want to create create dramatic images. You guys will be the judge of that over the next few minutes. Okay, and the engines have to be fired up and pushing or pulling something for it to count. Okay, Now, a lot of these photos are made rather than taken. This is out in McEwen, Oregon on the Sumter Valley Railroad. We get together, it used to be an ad hoc thing. You'd get a bunch of your buddies together. Back when things were far more affordable, you could get a small group together and pay the railroad to run the train for you. Most of the engines that run regularly, almost all the engines that run regularly, are for tourists. Tourists, for some reason, don't like the idea of getting up 2 hours before sunrise and going out and standing next to the tracks in the cold. Who knew? So we'll pay the railroad to get up early and get out and run the trains for us. This is a shot just after sunrise. This is something you couldn't get with the regular tourist schedule. Okay. Sometimes we go to a lot of work. If there are rail fans, a lot of you will recognize Pete Laro's setups. Pete Laro's a very talented photographer from down by Philadelphia who he's the most successful charter operator. And it used to be that you get a bunch of guys together and argue about what you wanted to do and pay the railroad, and then argue with the railroad what you wanted to do. And Pete's gotten into the business where he'll do the contracting with the railroad. And he's very talented. He does a lot of work. So when he sends out a notice saying we're doing another railroad, I just say, take my money. But this shot, we're about 1:45 in the morning at this point. There's an office building in the background. We had talked with the management of the office building and said, hey, can you turn out the lights when you go home? They said, we have a second shift. Can they turn out the lights? And so they cooperated. We're far enough out from the engine house and any other structure that we had to bring in 3 generators and something like 30 studio lights to light this. And we stood around waiting for the lights in the office building to go out. And we got a few minutes to shoot. And the best part was the next day started at 4:30 in the morning, about 95 miles to the west. So we do a lot of staging. This is another Pete Laro charter. We're down in Somerville, Georgia. Now I get a real kick out of this one. We've got a couple ladies from the local community theater, and a couple of folks with antique cars showed up and set this up. And when I show this photograph, almost inevitably I get somebody that looks at it for a minute and says, where did you find the women? Women are all over. Okay, that's 2 steam locomotives with a trick there. Hey, let's take a second and talk about how railroads try to categorize steam locomotives. A fellow named White, obviously British because he can't spell. We count the wheels. Okay, they have little wheels up front. These help support the smoke box, and they pull the locomotive into curves. The driving wheels are on a rigid frame, so they're going to try and go straight. And so the leading wheels will pull you into the curves a little bit. The driving wheels are the interesting ones with all the rods and pistons. And then the trailing wheels are there to support the firebox. And let's take a look at the side of a locomotive here. Okay, there we go. This is a 282. We've got 2 little wheels up front, then we've got the 8 driving wheels, and then we got 2 wheels hiding back here under the cab. Okay. Now they come in all sorts of flavors. You can have almost any arrangement you can think of. Towards the end of steam, they started getting fancy. Steam still has a lot of energy after it's gone through the cylinders the first time, so they were reusing it in a second set of cylinders, and basically making 2 steam locomotives under 1 boiler. So this has got 4 of the leading wheels up here, and we've got 6 and another 6 driving wheels, and then 4 wheels to support the firebox. Okay. And railroads would give the different wheel arrangements names. Some of them were more or less universal. Some of them varied by railroad. in New England, a 4/8 wheel arrangement was called a northern. But imagine being the locomotive salesman that had to call on the Southern Railway and try to sell something called a northern. So we've got different wheel arrangements with some of the common names. You've probably heard of the Big Boy that Union Pacific restored. Very latent steam, and the Union Pacific wanted a locomotive that could pull 100 cars at 100 miles an hour across the plains. And back in the steam days, pulling 100 cars was a real challenge. They didn't have bearings on the wheels. The axles rode on a little piece of brass, and then lubricated brass. So it was a lot of friction. So 100 cars in the steam days was a major challenge. The big boys weren't the biggest engines in the country, but they had the best PR department. And anybody that you ask or any newspaper report that you see will tell you they were the biggest. Getting the photos is a group sport. It's expensive to run a mainline steam locomotive. A full-size steam locomotive for a day, we usually go long enough, so railroad crews are limited to 12 hours work. Once we get all the photographers there, we try to get the railroad to let us work from before dawn to well after dusk. And so we usually go through 2 crews, but we often pay $15,000 a day to the railroad to run the. So this is a group sport. That explains why we've got all our friends standing there taking the pictures with us. And we have to suffer. There are guys that shoot video. Some of them are very nice. They're a nuisance. You have to be quiet for them. This is one of the locomotives that cost us a fortune to run. We were able to get it. There was some track where they could let it run at 49 miles an hour. So it went through a lot of coal and water. We had to pay a couple of fire departments to come fill it up through the day. But you can see the crowd we needed to pay that. But let's start looking at our railroads. We're out in the Pacific Northwest. Where'd we go? We've got Portland, Oregon is up here. The maps are a little funny because the railroads didn't fall into nice, neat. We got Portland, Oregon, and Seattle. And we're going to get down as far as Carson City, or Virginia City, just northeast of Carson City, and way out in the east side of the state there in Ely, Nevada. We're going to start. In the background there is the Pacific Ocean. I told you we're going to go coast to coast. So we're starting on the Pacific. This is the Oregon Scenic Railroad. This is a little 262. And we've got, this was a railroad that not only served the docks in the area, but was designed for lumbering. And actually, I skipped as we were going through. A real quick way to tell what a locomotive is designed to do is to look at the driving wheels. Little driving wheels are for moving loads at slow speed and starting and stopping. The bigger driving wheels are for running relatively light trains relatively fast on relatively level ground. And then in between is a variation on that. That's the short answer. It gets complicated in a hurry, but if you see an engine with small driving wheels, it's probably designed for low speed and in a place where they're going to be starting a lot. Here, that is the Pacific again, same locomotive. And
hauling wood there? Lumber?
Yeah, they've got lumber cars. I'm not sure where they got the logs for us. There are a couple of log cars that are loaded. We do our best to recreate what would have been. And here's a same locomotive a little further up. This is a fairly popular spot. If you're a rail fan, you've seen Fishery Point somewhere before. Then here we are in Oregon. This is in Portland, Oregon, in the Brooklyn Roundhouse, the Brooklyn section of Portland. I was very confused the first time I went to Portland. Everything in Portland, Oregon is weird. You drive east out of the city. You can't go east out of Portland. But they have a Brooklyn in Portland. This is the same locomotive we saw in the night shot before. The Oregon Rail Heritage Center has a couple of locomotives. Unfortunately, they don't have any track. They've got about 2/3 of a mile of track to get down to connect to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe freight main. And that line has been congested for 20 years now, and the railroad just doesn't have the room to let these guys come out and run. They put on a great show in the yard. With 2/3 of a mile of track, they were able to get up to 25 mile an hour or so and still get the thing stopped before they went through the roundhouse. But they felt that was important. And there's another shot of her at night. And one of these, the guy on your left is the owner of the engine, but they were out. The guys that rebuild these things love the opportunity to run them. You know, think of the work that goes into restoring a classic car. Multiply it by 1,000 to get a steam locomotive running. So if the guys get a chance to run it, they love to, particularly if somebody's paying for it. But we made the railroaders pose for us. We're jumping up. This is just out of Yacolt, Washington. Nobody knows where Yacolt was. In fact, this locomotive wasn't even on my radar, on my list of locomotives to find. And again, Pete was doing a charter. He sent out an email saying we're going up here. I said, take my money. This was a logging railroad. This is a unique engine. It's carrying its water in a tank over the boiler. It doesn't have a tender. This shortens the engine so it can go around tighter curves. And it also has the advantage of adding weight on the drivers so it adheres to the rail a little better and it can pull a little more. This was real popular for industrial applications and logging. But if there's a tunnel on the line, you have to get a shot of the train coming out of the tunnel. You know, there's no other reason to have a tunnel. Okay. So, you know, everybody's seen pictures of trains coming out of the tunnel. How about a train going into the tunnel? Okay, now you have to make sure you treat the crew with a lot of respect before you do a shot like this. And you promise them a very nice dinner if you survive. The locomotive came in very slowly, and the engineer practiced a couple times before they let us get on the tracks, and he knew where his spot was. And then the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad is just off to the west of Mount Rainier, and supposedly it's got these gorgeous views of Mount Rainier. And this is what I saw. You pay your money and you go rain or snow or whatever. But yeah, that's the best view I've had of Mount Rainier. Actually, I get beautiful views of Mount Rainier flying in and out every time, and then from the ground you don't see it.
What was that train originally used for?
This one?
Yeah.
This is another logging railroad. Yeah. There's another little short. It's here's a side view of it. Oops, we skipped ahead. There's a little short. See, you can see they've got a little bunker for wood. Locomotives burnt what they hauled. If you're in logging country, you didn't carry coal in, you burnt the wood. If you were in oil country, you burnt oil, and if you were coal country, you burnt coal. And you can see it's small wheels. He's got the tank over the boiler. And that, a note on what they burn. Several of the engines now have switched to burning used vegetable oil, and that's kind of neat. When they go by, they smell vaguely of French fries. We got a question back here?
Yeah, you had that Oregon. Before you went too far, after the Oregon that ran in like 3/4 of a mile of track,
Yeah.
the locomotive was, I thought, looking through here, I thought it was a 484. Is that true?
The
484 with big wheels. You don't have to go all the way back to it.
this fellow?
Yeah.
Yep, that is a 484.
So what was that used for when that had some track to run on?
That was a passenger locomotive for a fairly heavy train. Yeah, okay, let's Still on the logging railroad. Here's a little different sort of locomotive. We're all familiar with the locomotives that have the pistons parallel to the rails. And they're steam locomotives are very powerful, but they have a problem delivering the power to the rail. As you push on one side with the piston with the steam, and then there's a pause while you switch cylinders, then you push on the other side. So you're always pushing one side, and it's very, very quick pause, but physics doesn't care about how quick it appears to be. So if you're going uphill, you run into a problem every time you swap in pistons, you lose a little momentum. So several manufacturers came up with the idea of geared. The pistons different manufacturers have them vertically at a 45-degree angle, or we'll see a couple of these. But the wheels are attached to a drive shaft with a big gear like you used to get in back in the days of automobiles. You could understand the rear axle gears. And these were very clunky. Going downhill with a good stiff tailwind, you might get 10 miles an hour out of them. But they were designed to pull their own weight, the weight of the locomotive plus its weight again, up a 10% grade. And they proved to be very sure-footed, sure-wheeled maybe. They handled really rough track. So the logging operations, when they were going to take the lumber off a hill, would put a track down, putting down only many ties as they needed to keep the rails near each other. And it'd be fairly rough track, and as they finished up they'd log from the top, and as they came down a zone, they'd pull up the rail behind them to reuse on the next hill. And these proved to be very, very handy for that. They were very popular, and there were a lot of them in New Hampshire in the logging railroads. They also ended up in quarries fairly regularly. But there are different versions of that. We'll see a couple more. Here's the same railroad. We still haven't cleared. It's still overcast, but this is the two locomotives we saw crossing the bridge meeting each other. And they have a couple of cars with logs that they use for demonstrating on field trips for kids and to separate photographers from their money. Here's a different geared locomotive. These are the pistons here. They're going vertically, and you can see the drive shaft right along there. So there's always steady pressure on the wheels. So you're always under tension and always moving forward. And here they've got this thing rocking and rolling, and I can probably outrun it. That's it.
Who was the maker of those?
There were a variety of them. This was a Shay built by Lima. It gets a little confusing. The guys that held the patents on the design farmed it out to different builders. So we usually look at the design. This was a Shay built by Lima. The previous one was a Willamette. You've heard of Heislers. We'll see one. We'll see Vermont's only operating steam locomotive a little later. That's a Heisler. And the other one was a Climax. And there were probably minor builders that tried, you know. We're going to jump over to this is the Nevada Northern Railroad. And this is why we pay the railroad. Their normal excursion train leaves at 10 or 11 in the morning. And we wanted them out in the desert for sunup. We were out well before dawn. And then one of the things I love about going out west is how open it is. When I go out to the Mojave Desert, one of the neat things is not only do you see the entire train coming at you, but if you've got a little elevation, you can frequently see the train coming at you with the one behind it, and often the one behind it. But this is the Nevada. This is the same train we saw a minute ago. When we're out there, we actually make the railroad work for a living. They posed briefly for the sunrise shot, and they backed way up and drove by again, and then we make them do it again. One of the problems working with the videographers is they want the train out of sight for the beginning of the shot. And if you've got an open vista like this, the train has to go a long ways back.
I got a kind of a dumb question. You're seeing smoke. Some of it's from combustion and some of it's steam.
Right.
Is the combustion smoke always dark?
The question is, what are we seeing? We're seeing smoke and steam. Okay. A clean burning fire has very little soot coming out of it. So in some places it's clear. We actually get the engine crew to make smoke for us. A lot of the smoke you see would have gotten an engineer in trouble back in the day. But we're out to make dramatic photos. If it's white, it's probably steam. If it's black, it means they've just thrown rock. Usually rock coal gives you the blackest, but it might be wood too. So the fire isn't as hot as it might be, and you're getting more soot up the...
So the steam and the results of combustion be mixed together?
Yeah. Okay. And when you see it blowing out the sides, that's steam. Yeah, we'll see a couple more of those, and I'll try to remember to point it out. Once again, we've got a tunnel, and we have to make them come out of the tunnel. Of course, we also did into the tunnel. This was a railroad built to service the silver mines in northwest Nevada. What was the big silver strike out there? Comstock. What? The Comstock, the mother lode out there was the. This is an abandoned silver mine, but there were several of these along the lines. But this railroad existed until the silver petered out. Actually, I'm going to skip Leadville on this show, actually. I was thinking I was going to... Sorry?
Is that train that you just showed us on the narrow gauge?
This last one was actually... the question was that narrow gauge? Let me stop and explain gauge. It's the distance between the rails. Standard gauge is 4 foot, 8.5 inches between the rails. That's what 99% of the freight traffic and pretty much all the regular day in, day out passenger traffic runs on in the country. When railroads started building, nobody thought of making a kinetic system. You built what you thought you needed. The Erie Railroad was built with 6 foot gauge. And they got to the point where when people figured out, hey, wait a minute, you can load a boxcar in one place and just keep handing it to railroads to get it wherever you want. The Erie Railroad had to stop and get their main line from New Jersey to Chicago. They changed from 6 foot to 4 foot 8.5 inches in 24 hours. Yeah, that was a lot of guys moving a lot of rail. The Virginia and Truckee Railroad for the silver mine was standard gauge. Now we've jumped over. This is the Sumter Valley Railroad in eastern Oregon. Baker City is the only city of any size. This is 45 minutes or so west in McEwen. This is narrow gauge. This is 2 foot, so the rails are 2 feet wide. It makes the equipment a lot smaller. It's less expensive. You can go around a tighter curve. It was cheaper to build the railroad. Of course, it limits what you can carry. But when the logging railroads were built, we were still cutting down trees by hand. And then various steam mechanized tools came along. But in a small railroad that was cutting down what a crew of loggers would cut in a day, you didn't need to carry an awful lot. But we're out before dawn here, and they had 2 engines out for us. They've got a 282 the wheel arrangement's called a Mikado almost everywhere. And then the other one is a Heisler, which is one of the geared manufacturers. Let's see if we see. Here's the shot at the beginning here where I had the beautiful smoke plume was also on this railroad. And we were set up for a sunrise shot. And the train went by us. We're working with 2 trains. There's actually a switch for a siding behind this train. The first train had dropped the conductor off to throw the switch for the second train so they didn't have to stop. So they were going back down, and they stopped to pick up the conductor. And I don't remember what the shot coming at me looked like, but I thought that one was worth keeping. And this is a little later. This is what we were actually set up for. Yummy. And these are the Elkhorn Mountains in the background. These guys also, there was also silver mining in the area. So the railroad was happy to haul that too. And these piles of stone or slag from silver mines. But, pretty country. And then still on the Sumter Valley. Hey, let's take a little longer look at the Nevada Northern. Here's Reno, and Utah is over on the far side there. I got the world's best GPS directions. I'd stayed in Reno and had to go to Ely, and the GPS said turn right onto US 50 East. In 346.2 miles, your destination will be on the right. Some magazine wrote an article on the US 50 is the world's loneliest highway. A lot of the land is owned by the Navy and I think the Marine Corps. They use for they lease it for cattle ranching, but they want to own the land that they're doing their silly training on in case one of their planes falls. But you cannot get out there, and I was baffled because the only traffic that I had to go around heading east were big trucks filled with hay. The only traffic I passed coming west were big trucks filled with hay. Okay, couldn't you have made a deal here, Dad? But yeah. And apparently it is required halfway across to stop and stand in the middle of the road and take a picture of the nothing. Okay, but the Nevada Northern was the copper mining railroad that shut down after World War II, and they expected to come back, so they packed everything up and left it so they could restore it. They were fortunate. They've got almost all the original shop buildings and the engine house for heavy work. And please forgive me, there'll be a couple shots where diesels sneak in, but those were World War II vintage diesels, so they're legitimate, but they're still diesels. This is inside the engine house. This is one of the museums I love. They run a couple of shoots every February, and you go, and Friday afternoon you go and sign in and get a badge, and then they tell you, put the engine back when you're done with it, and don't stand in front of the train. But you can go in the engine house, talk to the guys, lick the engine if you care. But they put on a neat show. They've got all the equipment that they used in the steam days. They've got a coaling tower and a sanding tower and a water tower. And you got to watch them servicing the engines, and then we get them out. Country's a little different than Vermont. We're out in the high plains. This would have been it's probably a little short. Probably 18 or 20 cars would have been a standard run for them back in the day. But this was one, and we probably had 50 photographers. It was nice because we were spread out over 1.5 miles or 2 miles and didn't trip over each other. But here we are back in the yard. They're backing in to get water. Of course, we'd gone out for the winter spectacular photo shoot, and if you notice, there wasn't much snow. But there was a little bit. But they were kind to us, and overnight, Saturday night, they brought in some snow for us. And they had the Railway Express Agency was the UPS of its time. It used to be pretty common if you wanted to send a package, you'd go down to the depot, hand it to the agent, and he'd put it on the train, and they'd figure out where to take it off that train and put it on the next train. And then when it got to the far end, you could either go to the station and pick it up, or you could pay the Railway Express Agency to bring it what we now call the last mile. Okay, so they were, Railway Express Agency truck survived, and we made the deposit for us. And, well, I guess I cut it for time, but the director of the railroad ended up spending a lot of time moving boxes off a couple of the boxcars for us into the Railway Express Agency van. I guess it's not all that glamorous to run an excursion railroad. They have a working steam crane. Railroads used to have to clean up their own messes. It was also handy for construction. This one, I believe, could lift 200 tons. Let's see, my notes say it was purchased in 1909. They spent a fortune, $17,600 on it. And it actually works. They alternate years. Some years they'll do a demonstration where they go out and pick up logs and put them on cars for you. I haven't seen that yet. But it comes with its own tool car, all the variety of crane apparatus that you can dream of. For photography, your best light is the very early and very late. And here we are, we're getting set up for a night shot, but this is still natural light. It's sitting there that's the old freight house. As it got darker, we put on some lights on it. That's Mark Bassett is the director of the railroad standing there on the front of the engine for us. But it's a neat place to visit. It's getting tougher and tougher to find places that'll let you walk in and actually touch the equipment. And it's just fascinating to get in and talk with the guys that run it. We're going to jump east a little bit. We're in Greater Colorado. Where'd we go? We got Denver up here, the Georgetown Loop Railroad. And how many people have ridden the Durango in Silverton? Oh, yeah, usually it's about 30%. The Cumbres and Toltec was originally part of the same line as the Durango and Silverton. They started over here in Antonito, Colorado, and they crisscross over the border. I've forgotten if it's 7 or 9 times or something to get around the hills, and they come down. And now this one survived. It was originally built to service the silver mines, but about the time they were ready to give up the railroad, it wasn't worth investing in diesels. There wasn't going to be a railroad much longer. But somebody was putting in a pipeline up there, and the only way to get the pipeline materials in was by railroad. So they survived as a working steam railroad into the late 1960s. And actually, Dad drove us across the country in 1966. So one of the few times I've seen a legitimately working steam railroad was sitting on there was a parking lot in downtown Durango, and my brother and I sat on the guardrail watching them switch cars back and forth in the yard. Well past the time my parents thought we should be in bed. And we're also going to go out here into Arizona to the Grand Canyon Railway. Well, it's the Georgetown Loop. They call it a loop railroad because a standard steam locomotive, a mainline steam locomotive we think of, has real trouble on a 2.5 or 3% grade. Okay. So the railroads often got around this, several places they got around it, by making a circle. And what you did was you went further to climb the same height, which lowered the grade, which let you actually lift stuff. So this is the Georgetown Loop. The tracks are going between these two bridge piers on the bottom side of that. Is that a question or? No. No. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So they go around. Okay. I'm standing in the same spot, looking down. And you can see the train coming underneath us, and you can also see another part of the loop up here. And once again, these are all tourist operations. But these guys went clanking slowly up the hill. It's pretty neat engineering to see how they solved it. And we're off to the Durango and Silverton, which is probably the most famous excursion line in the country. These guys set the pace for all the other excursion outfits. They do a phenomenal job, and they're busy as all get out. They can run 4 or 5 trains a day during the tourist season. And they're famous. They run along the Animas River Gorge, and they had to blast the hills to make a shelf for the tracks most of the way. And the joke used to be that they couldn't paint the cars because there wasn't enough room. If they painted it, it would scrape the rock as they came through. It actually curves back around. There's a national forest up there. This was back before organized charters were a big thing. So I'd gotten up there in the wee hours of the morning to make sure there was nothing going on the tracks. And once I got through that rock cut, I started up the hills. So I'd go up, and I think when I was out there, they ran 4 trains up in the morning, and then they had to come back in the afternoon. So I was up there for 3 days. And this would have been probably 2000 when I was still able to hike a little bit. But I'd forgotten that we were starting at about 6,700 feet and going up. And then the other feature of this was every afternoon we had a strong thunderstorm just before the trains came back down. So I was up in the woods getting wet and miserable, but it was worth it.
Are the authentic cars? Because I feel like it when you're in
There are some that were original and some that they built for the tourist. And anyway, you can see the river down below. At this point, they're a little over 400 feet above it. And this is one of the conductors usually joke as you're going. They tell you not all to rush to the river side of the car because you don't want to go down the hill. But they've been doing it for 140 years. They aren't going down the hill. This used to be part of the same railroad. It's now the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. And they're they run out of Chama, New Mexico to Antonito, Colorado. And Chama is a really cute little western town. When I first was going out there, it took me a minute to figure out where to stay. Obviously, stayed at the place called The Hotel. Okay. And where's breakfast? The Diner. It was pretty... but last time I was out there, this was still another place where you could get in and talk to the crews. The first morning I was out there, I'd actually followed the crews down. They have to clean the fire a couple times a day. So I followed the crews down to watch them clean out the fire and tend the engine. And they said, "Oh, here, we'll give you a ride back." Okay. I'm willing to climb up in the cab of a steam engine on most days. Okay. But these guys go up a 4% grade coming out of Chama, going up the hill. And so it takes a couple of engines, at least a couple of engines. Here we are running, this is, I'm drawing a blank on what stop that is with the water tank. But for quite a ways out of town, there's a 2-lane state highway that parallels it beautifully. And going uphill, if you get too far ahead, you really have to wonder if they're still moving. So it's not much of a... But I had actually flown into Denver, and I was calling it a Hyundai roller skate. I don't know what the actual model was, but it was about as big as a desktop computer. And I drove around like this for a week. It was brand new. I had to take the plastic off the mirrors before I got out of the... but I got out of town here. It was a hot day. It was already 100 degrees before they left town. So I was getting out of the car and leaving the car running for the air conditioning. I got 12 or 14 miles out of town. It's all open ranch country. And I must have kicked the door lock when I got out. I slammed the door, went across, took the picture. And of course, with an excursion train, everybody in the excursion train wants to wave to everybody they see on the side. And even if they didn't have the idea, as soon as the guy in the first car waves and you wave back, then everybody goes, "Oh, look, he's waving." So you have to stand and wave to the whole train going back. So the train's going up the hill away from me, and I haven't seen a car in a long time. I go back and can't get into my car. This is where growing up outside of Boston came in handy. A little piece of little piece of barbed wire from the fence, and I was able to unlatch the passenger side and get back in and get going. And I probably missed 2 shots because the train wasn't going that fast. But, it was an eventful day. There's another story coming. And here, this train is going as fast as it can.
Yeah, the smoke is going straight.
The smoke is going straight up. Usually, when a train's moving, the smoke curls back over the train. But here, they're working it for all they could, and the smoke is going straight up. This actually proved to be a headache for photography because it would, when it went straight up, it was frequently shadowing the nose of the engine, which, why would you do that? That's why I'm here. This gives you a look at the actual grade they were on. This is with a little bit of a telephoto. But here, this is at the top of the hill. They're going to take one of the engines off, but you can see that what they've been coming up against. Okay. Then as we get down here, the next one is Los Pinos. This is, after this, they go up into the national forest, and there's a section for a couple 100 miles where there's one road crossing and no other way to get them unless you're on the train. And the road I'm on was on a couple 100 feet high of riprap, and it lowered as you got closer to the tank. And the only place I could find to park was probably 3/4 of a mile from where I was standing. And I'd gotten there and not sure where the train was. I got out and was waiting. I turned around and looked up the road, and it's open range country. So coming down the road are 25 or 30 steer. And I was thinking, my doctor always said that red meat would do me in. I just hadn't thought she meant on the hoof. Unfortunately, a logging truck came along, and he applied the air horn several times, and the cattle went down the bank rather than me. But yeah, the train showed up, and I got the shot. And coming back that afternoon, the same guy that drew the scenery for the Roadrunner cartoons built the scenery out here. The railroad wraps entirely around this little knoll coming down. This is also one of 3 places that I've ever seen a rattlesnake while I'm out watching trains. But he was out basking and didn't care about me. Here they are back in the yard. The derby hat is actually more accurate than the striped hat with the bill. The striped hat with the bill came along in the early days of diesels. The derby was much more common for railroaders than the steam engine. But he's got a hose connected to the air compressor for the brakes, and he's cleaning out the fire. He's blowing all the cinders out, and they've got a shaker to drop the clunkers out the bottom. And they were quite content to have me wandering around and watching. Now we're jumping over to the Grand Canyon Railway. They go from Williams, Arizona, just a little west of Flagstaff, up to the south rim of the Grand Canyon. It's owned by one of the big resort companies, and it's actually an amazing operation. They've got heavy welded rail, and they don't run the steam engines regularly anymore, but their diesel trains are going at 50 miles an hour up to the canyon. And they were able to open up the steam engines for us when we were out there. But we went out again in February, and only at the highest elevations did we run into snow. Actually, I flew into Phoenix for the first time, and was really bothered when I got to Phoenix when it was 85 degrees, and I was going to Flagstaff for the first night. And it's only like 180 miles, but you climb like 3,800 feet, which I hadn't realized. That's one of the neat things about the hobby is you get off the beaten track and learn oddball things about the country. Here's the same engine. The fireman's got the firebox door opened, and he's feeding the fire. That's why we can see the flames flashing out. And back on the southern end of the line, we've run out of snow, but this one's coming along probably a little better than 40 mile an hour, which is a very impressive sight. We had to get out of the way of the regular passenger train, and we got a diesel. But these diesels would have been built just after World War II, so once again, this could have happened. And they had both engines out for us. They have a 280 and a 282. And this is They're side by side, and of course, if you've got two engines, you make the railroad put them together for you. How many of you know where the term double header came from in baseball? Two locomotives, two heads. There's a lot of railroading that snuck into language. You've heard of guys on the fast track. You've probably gotten sidetracked. Anybody ever have a high ball? In the early days of signals, they were a ball on a rope. And if it was okay to go, they pulled the rope and put the ball up, and the engineer would see the high ball and go. This is what counts as a massive bridge in the Arizona desert. For several hours a year, there's rushing water under it. We made them park on the bridge under the stars for us.
What are all the little lights down?
This is for the stairs in the cab. That one is probably over the, it's either the generator or the air pump. But they're something that the crew might have to work on. And I say, okay, we're going to move east a little bit. We're looking, it's sort of an odd map, sorry. We've got Cleveland up top. We've got Charleston, West Virginia down here in Roanoke. All the way down to Chattanooga. We'll look at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. The Cass Scenic Railroad in Cass, down by, where's the big radio telescope? Green Bank? It's just down by Green Bank. The Western Maryland Scenic out of Cumberland, Maryland. The Age of Steam Roundhouse out in Ohio. And on up, all the way up into Western Connecticut for this batch. But here we're starting the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum in Chattanooga. Here we are arriving at the Chattanooga station. This was a neat trip. We kept crossing all sorts of creeks that, if you've read any Civil War history, you kept crossing places where they fought.
Is that the Chattanooga? Yeah.
Well, it is now. They have two working steam engines. If you followed steam engines for a while, the Southern Railroad at the end of steam had a couple of locomotives that they used for, last run excursions, and they've ended up here. And they do a beautiful job of them. And once again, we got a couple of guys with antique cars. Of course, we couldn't get this guy not to look at the photography. He was just so amazed that so many idiots would stand there by the track and watch a train that we couldn't get him to watch the train when it went by. But we thanked him anyway. This is actually where, at the Chattanooga station, is where we actually hauled down the 50-star flag. We had a really brisk wind, and it's conceivable you might have gotten the flag stretched out enough to see it. But once again, we have a tunnel. We have to have the train coming out of the tunnel.
Were those Southern engines 462 or 464?
One's a 282, and the other's a 280. And of course, with two of them, we have to have a double header. And if you've never heard a double-headed steam freight train, it is spectacular. And I remember on one of my first trips, organized trips, we were on the Cumberland Scenic Railroad out of Cumberland, Maryland, and they come up the hill, and there's a spot where they go all the way around the valley for the grade. The farm in the middle of the curve is owned by the Helmstetter family, so it was always known as Helmstetter's Curve, going back to the days of the real railroad. And I went out, and the first time the train came up the hill, and he wasn't working very hard at all, and just went zipping up by us. And I was thinking, well, that's not very exciting, but we had him back down and come up again, and this time the engine was working for all it was worth, and it was really going. And it wasn't until the engine got by that I noticed that they'd set the brakes on all the cars for us. And here we are. This is the Chickamauga Creek, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is going back. These were taken on slide film and scanned. This is the Ohio Central. It's a 484, originally built for the Grand Trunk railroad in Michigan. And it had been, it was fairly freshly rebuilt out here. The Ohio Central was a short line that I guess he was still actually practicing, but he was getting close to retirement. An orthodontist had bought, so he'd have a place to run his steam locomotive. And so we were out here with an excursion train, and they take us out, we get off, and they run by us a couple times, we get back on. And the owner of the railroad shows up and says, "We just got a call from the CSX Railroad, and they need us to pull the coal train out of the siding and take it down to would you guys like to put your train in the siding and watch a coal train?" So yes. So here's a steam engine working an actual revenue service. And on a day like this, a coal train that would take 2 or 3 diesels, no problem for a big steam engine. And the first time in the 1980s, when personal computers, when computers got small enough so you could actually move them, remember steam locomotives were all built with slide rules and calipers. There was no computing power going into it. It was all engineer brain. A fellow he was looking at making a gas turbine, or a steam turbine locomotive that would, instead of driving the pistons directly, he'd make steam and spin a turbine and use electric motors like a diesel. And so he dug out the Chesapeake and Ohio 614 and put a lot of sensors on it so they could get some idea of what the thing could actually do, which nobody had ever been able to do before. And I went down to Hinton, West Virginia, and the engine was too heavy to go over to the bridge into the yard. So it was a chassis system railroad at that point. They had 3 of their new 3,500 horsepower locomotives, and they sent those down to get the coal train. And they came back up working fairly hard and spitting a lot of sand on the rail to give them traction, came creeping up. And I said, well, this is going to be a show. And they cut the diesels off, and the steam engine backed on and tested their brakes. And they they blow the whistle twice when they're about to move forward. And the engine blows twice, and I was like, yeah. The engine went, and it was gone. And it was pretty impressive. And the next time I saw a display, I was on Attica, New York. There's a stiff hill coming east out of Buffalo. And in those days, the Delaware and Hudson and Conrail both ran trains over it. And Conrail had newer, bigger locomotives, but they were using 3 or 4 on every train. And the Delaware and Hudson have 4 or 5 up front and 2 or 3 in the back to get up over the hill. And it was always a question whether everybody's going to get up and over. And one of the nickel plate 765 came out and ran from Buffalo east. And we figured, okay, we'll get up here on the hill, we'll get a good show and have all the time in the world to get ahead of it. And it didn't seem to notice it was a hill. But we're still on the Ohio Central. This was a relative of the Pacifics that used to live at Steamtown here in Bellows Falls, now down in Scranton. And sorry, more diesels. But again, they're early diesels. They would have. We had 2 engines, so they had a section of double track, so we got them racing each other. And we always, for a fan trip, you always end up with a railroad management fairly high up just to keep an eye on things. And this is the first time I ever saw a manager turn and walk away with his eyes covered. I don't think they were anywhere near the speed limit. We're going to jump up to Cass. This was another logging railroad, and they have a collection of the geared locomotives. They've got the 3 big builders, Heisler, Climax, and Shea. They have the last one built, the biggest one, and it's a neat place. Their passenger cars are sort of circus colors. It's to entertain the tourists.
We actually visited there, and the park guard at the end of the day took us all through the shop.
Oh, the shop.
All deteriorated, probably got asbestos on their lungs.
Yeah.
But it was really a very interesting day.
Yep.
And again, very free, flowing.
Yeah, she said she visited Cass, and one of the rangers took her through the shops. And yeah, actually, I think on this trip, we had dinner, and then they opened the shops and let us wander in, and it was neat. We talked to a couple of guys. One guy had only been as far as Charleston, West Virginia, once in his life, and never left the valley other than that. And
Back through through Green Bank, back out towards, I guess it was Stanton, Virginia. Coming back through Green Bank, when we visited the radio telescope place,
Yeah.
I made a point of saying that just about everything that'll make a spark, everything that is more alternating current than a battery, is just
Yeah.
about illegal in that valley, so they can get
Yeah.
radio
The-
reception from the heavens.
The radio telescope just nearby, the next valley over, is actually very sensitive. They pick up all the cars driving through the valley, and they'll pick up almost any alternating current. So they discourage it. But actually on the shop tour we got in, they had one that needed repairs, but it had to be fired up so they could test the steam. And we were there in October, and I asked, why aren't you working on that? And the shop crew said, well, the shop's not heated. We're saving that until it gets cold. Okay. And railroaders are a very, very practical lot. You have to be to survive. We had a kid that had to drop out of school in 6th grade, and he was drilling. They have stay bolts that go through the boiler and the firebox to reinforce it. And the boilers aren't actually round. They're sort of they vary by locomotive class, but this one was sort of elongated keyhole shape. And this kid was showing us on the back of a coal shovel with a piece of coal. He was scratching out the geometry that he needed to figure out how to drill the hole and tap it. I couldn't follow it, but they knew that if the engine stopped working, they didn't have a job. So they were going to find a way to make them run. They have a little section of where they have 3 tracks just by the station. So we make them race. The guy on the fire track is falling behind a little, and you can't really see him. This is neat. To get up the hill, they don't have the luxury of going around a loop. So they have switchbacks where you go up the grade and you stop, and you throw a switch behind you and go up the next section of grade and work your way up the mountain. Excuse me. Here we are on the Western Maryland Scenic. This was a 280 that ran down there for many, many years. Every 1,492 days that you operate a steam locomotive, after that, the ticket, the license to run it, wears out. And you pretty much have to disassemble it down to the wheels to inspect it and rebuild it. So the 734 came up on her 1492 is what they call it. And we thought that steam was gone on this railroad. We had a nice surprise. It'll pop up in a second. But here's the 734. This is a beautiful little ride. Oh, I guess I didn't have. They've actually gone and gotten an engine out of the old Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore. They've got a 2662, a huge monster that they've put back together, and it's in service. It's the biggest engine running regularly, and it's worth a trip if you're interested in steam engines. Here we are on the Everett Railroad. It's probably 4:30 in the morning, but and we were fortunate that the station master drove his car in that morning. Entirely coincidence, yeah, right. Here he is getting going. We were asking about steam versus smoke before. He's blowing both out the stack, but out of the sides he's blowing steam. The cylinders in the front, steam will compress, but water won't. And if the water condenses while they're sitting, if you try to start the engine, you're likely to blow the end of the cylinder off. I've actually seen an engine do that. It's pretty impressive, a thing the size of a manhole cover shooting down the tracks at tens, if not a couple hundred miles an hour. So they, when they get going, they call it blowing down. They have valves in the bottom of the cylinders that the engineer can open up and let the steam and the water out so they don't crack the cylinders. And we had a beautiful day the first day, and the second day wasn't that wonderful. We've jumped up to the Strasburg Railroad down in Amish country in Pennsylvania. Another neat place to visit. You can see we made him get up early and take us out for sunrise. We got lucky with a Model A showing up. Yeah, that was a toss-up. Yeah. And here they are. That's a sort of a precarious position. He's standing on a little steel plate between the engine and the tender and just hanging on with a hand. And that's the fireman. He's got a good fire going. He doesn't need to. And the weather didn't get much better than this, and the next morning was kind of tough, but interesting mood. We got a couple of the railroaders with a railroader's truck. Who knows what they were talking about, but they posed nicely for us for half an hour. And by midday, it was just a deluge, and we were all miserable, so we retreated into the shops, and the poor crews ended up posing for us, and you have to oil the engines. And during the war, we all heard of Rosie the Riveter. Rosie also worked on the railroads. There were a lot of jobs in the yards and the shops that they thought a woman could handle. And so here we've got, once again from the local community theater, we've got Rosie. We kept pointing out to her that her face was far too clean for somebody working on steam locomotives, but she really resisted all of us coming up to smear grease on her face. Well, you got to work with... This fellow actually works for the railroad these days. This wasn't a planned photo, but we saw him, and I thought he was a interesting-looking character, and it's historic now. But in the steam days, we didn't have radios for the train crews to use, so they all had hand signals. And this conductor is telling the engineer to come back. Standing on the end of the train, he's backing up to pick us up. We took a break between the afternoon shots and our evening shot, and I was walking back to the car for dinner. I said, I don't know why we wasted the rest of the day out here. Okay, we're going to jump over to the Reading and Northern Railroad that runs out of Hamburg, Pennsylvania. They've got 2 engines restored now. This is the 425, so obviously called the 4 1/4. And she was designed for fast passenger trains. And this was another place where the railroad management turned their heads away and just shook their heads as he came down a 30-mile-an-hour section of track, probably a little over 50 for us. But it's an amazing sight. And here we are in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. We've had a long day already, and it can't decide whether it's going to rain or snow on us. It's right in that, but it's doing something all the time. And the town was deserted for some odd reason. At 8 o'clock on a snowy night. But there was a couple with a kid that happened to wander by and saw the lights and steam engine, was wondering what was going on, and came by. So they immediately got drafted to pose for us. Okay, and we're going to jump up to the Connecticut Antique Machinery Association in Kent, Connecticut, down in the southwest corner of the state. It's antique machinery, so there's all sorts of stuff besides engine. They've got this is a locomotive from the a Hawaiian sugar plantation that they saved. Odd place to save it, but glad to see it was saved. They only run it 2 weekends a year, and they only have about 2/3 or 3/4 of a mile of track. They go back and forth all day for you.
Is that narrow gauge looks like?
Yeah, that's 3 foot. And then indoors, they have the funniest looking roundhouse you ever saw. They have a whole bunch of steam engines without any wheels. Steam was used to power all sorts of all the mills. The mills built in New England because they could use the water power. But once steam came along, you could put a mill anywhere and run a steam engine to drive your looms or whatever you were working. Okay, we're going to jump up to the East Broad Top. This is a real treat. This is another railroad that shut down, and they had to build all their own equipment because they weren't standard gauge. So they had a heavy shop for the locomotives. They had a car shop. They had a foundry. They had all of it, and it all stayed intact. And they're putting it back together slowly. They had their own delivery truck. These are all Baldwins, yeah. The fellow in the plaid owns the bed and breakfast across the street. I've forgotten who the tan jacket, but they knew very well that they had to keep the railroad running if they were going to, a bed and breakfast in Orbisonia, Pennsylvania isn't a very viable business if there's no railroad. They were very gracious, and the bed and breakfast had a great lunch. Here they're going by the car foundry. And these are all narrow gauge. Coming through the yard. Let's see, we've got one. Okay, the next one is the locomotive on the right has a cracked boiler and hasn't run in decades. But you can see that it's sitting there simmering for us. It's blowing smoke, it's just sitting on the siding. Okay. We had theatrical smoke bombs. Here's one of the railroad employees dropping the smoke bomb in for us. And we might have overdone it. Okay, but so yeah, we're making these images instead of taking them. Here's the train going by the station. This would have been a fairly typical consist. They have a boxcar for, they used to call it LCL, less than carload freight. And then they had a coal train, which is the reason the train ran. And then on the back, they'd have a combine car, a parlor car, and it probably sorted mail on the day as well.
They also helped to carry the material for building the Pennsylvania Turnpike. They helped to put themselves out of business by helping.
They helped move material for the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Yeah, the railroads were any business at all in the end days. Here's the bed and breakfast owner is also a conductor for them. They've stopped. They're putting, I guess that's sand. They have all the neat shop buildings. And then the new management has cracked down a little bit. It used to be that you could walk right in the roundhouse and touch everything and talk to the guys. The liability is just too much, but it's a sad thing. But here we are. I took this before the new owners came along and bought the place, and I titled that "Waiting for the Call." And when I took it, it seemed to be a pipe dream that they might actually get the call to fire it up and work it again. But they have. Their shops were driven by a steam boiler in the back that ran there are overhead shafts, and then there are leather belts coming down to drive the machine tools. Okay, obviously this was before OSHA. But this worked very well. They are restoring all this. They're going to make this a working exhibit so you can actually watch it. Turns out that the fellows that made the boiler for this also made the boilers on the Titanic. And they hadn't realized that any of their boilers still existed. They've moved on to other machine stuff. And when they heard it, they came running up to ask if they could restore it. And of course, the railroad was going to pay to restore it. Yeah.
One of my friends swore that he had been in those shops. They were abandoned. You could walk in. Between the time it closed in 1956 and the time that the scrapper started to make it work again.
Yeah.
He said he saw cups of coffee sitting on the benches
That,
and so forth.
yeah,
And it was just abandoned. They came into work one morning and were told to go home. It was over.
yeah. He said he had a friend that got into the shops between the time it shut down and it got resurrected, and it was a very sudden end. This was probably the most photographed railroad calendar in the world. This was left on one of the workbenches, and it tells you when the railroad gave up. And now this was built before electricity was really common, so they lit the roundhouse with big windows. You can see they added the light later. And they have all the tools. If you need to adjust your watch, they've got the wrench for it. And you look at the wrenches and you see the odd twists and turns and offsets, and you know that they made that wrench for one specific job. There's a bolt on the locomotive somewhere that they couldn't reach with That other one. There's the blacksmithy's, his forge right there in the middle of the work floor. And he left his tools. Just put them down and walked out. But I'm running along here, so I want to speed up a little bit. We're jumping up into New England and beyond. We're going down as far as Scranton, and we'll come up. Actually, I guess we haven't made it quite to New England. We're going to do New York, and we've got Syracuse, Binghamton, Scranton, and this is New York down here. This is the engine that they brought out to test when they were thinking of building the steam turbine. It was a fast freight and passenger engine, and they ran it up the New Jersey transit tracks from Hoboken to Port Jervis, New York. And the transit tracks are good for 79 miles an hour. And the train crew was having a ball. And I followed it several days, but every evening after it was too late to vote, I made sure I stopped at one of the stations where you're standing on the platform and a steam locomotive going through at 79 miles an hour is impressive. The New York Susquehanna and Western ended up with a Chinese-built 282. The Chinese had our plans that we handed over to them in World War II, and they built steam engines into the late 1980s. They had lots of coal, and labor in China is free. You do what you're told, so they didn't have the labor cost to worry about. So they built steam locomotives while they're building their diesel locomotive capacity, building capacity. A couple of railroads imported them to the U.S., one of which was an old Saybrook, it's Old Saybrook. I'll think of it as Essex. Thank you. Yes, senility's catching me. Essex ended up with one, and the owner of the New York Susquehanna and Western, who was a flagrant rail fan, he just loved running trains. He saw it and he was so impressed with it, he went to and called the guys in China and said, "Build me one." So they did, and they put it on a freighter, and the freighter sank in the Bay of Bengal. So the engine that they'd bought was going to be numbered 141, and after they lost that, the Valley Railroad agreed to sell this one to them. So this became the 142. And I misspent a lot of my grad school days riding around on this, and I'm probably one of the few rail fans that's crawled under the tender to help them re-rail it. But and this is also the one that I saw blow the cylinder head off. But you can see how small. This is a medium-sized freight locomotive. You can see it is much, much smaller than the other one. We're jumping over to Hannock, Pennsylvania. This is one of the big viaducts in Pennsylvania, and I always wondered what it was like when the surveyors took the investors out for a hike along the line, and they said, "Okay, we're going to come up around the hill over there and build a bridge over to that hill, and then continue." What was that middle part? But yeah, that's a pretty impressive bridge. Here we've got the 142 again. This is down in Charlotte, New Jersey. This ran in. This is Remsen, New York, up north of Utica. They moved around a lot on it. Nice little engine. And I feel old when I show this one. That's Joe Dillon is the engineer. Joe's been retired about 5 years now, and we're in regular touch over Facebook. But it came up to visit. It ran Bellows Falls to Chester on the Green Mountain Railroad, and that was in the late 1997. Don't quote me on that, but late 1990s. But here it is, leaving Bellows Falls. You went up to Chester. Yeah, you wrote it. Yeah. Oh, it was service. Yeah, she's got a photo of it down in North Walpole where it's being served. And here we see the next generation of rail fans inspecting it in Chester. I did not hire this kid. This kid just showed up. Okay, now we're jumping to New England. We're going to see Vermont's only operating steam locomotive. Clark's Trading Post has a bunch of them. Loon Mountain has one. And then the Conway Scenic has one. And then we've got there are a couple of main narrow gauge ones that we'll look at. Give me it. I just blew by Vermont's. Dr. Marvin Kendall up in Passumpsic. He's got this one restored and it's operational. Marvin is aging and ailing, and his sons have had complications, so it hasn't run for some time, but it is capable of running. It's packed away in the engine house. They read a book on the geared locomotives, on the Heislers, and decided they had to have one. Okay, logical thinking. So they looked around and they found a fellow down in Louisiana that had one on the sugar plantation. And they went down and talked to the fellow, and the engine was rusting out in the field. But the owner decided it, it was part of the family history and he couldn't bear to part with it. So they looked around further, and this came out of a Missouri quarry, where they bought it and fixed it up, and it's actually traveled all the way across the country for a steam locomotive gathering in Sacramento back in the day. The fellow from Louisiana came up to see what they'd done with it, was so impressed he gave him the other one. So they've got one waiting to be restored, and hopefully they can get going again. Now, Clark's Trading Post in Lincoln has collected a bunch of the locomotives that used to work the logging railroads in northern New Hampshire. This is a little, again, it's a tank engine. It's got the water overhead, and it's a 242, which is an odd wheel arrangement anywhere except a logging railroad. Actually, this is neat. They used to have a day every fall where they would fire up everything that they could make run. And it was neat. Not only did they have this, I remember spending a very pleasant couple of hours driving a steam road roller, steamroller, an actual steamroller. And this was another place where you could crawl all over everything. You see, they've got a wooden pole between the car and the engine. This was a common practice in the early days of railroading. It had the advantage of not only could you push cars around on your track, but you could put the car on the track, put the pole to the car on the track next to you, and push that. The disadvantage was that eventually that pole is going to snap, and it's under a lot of pressure, and it's going to go spitting in opposite directions with enough velocity to do serious damage. So that's no longer allowed, but they used to demonstrate it. They've got a little covered bridge, and the cars and the engines are painted up for the tourists, but they are working steam engines. They're worthy of. This is we talk about the gear, though. This is a Climax. The pistons are at a 45-degree angle, and again, they have the drive shaft. Here's.
Pushing or pulling?
They were pushing in these. They used to, on a lot of the logging railroads, they would make sure the cars were always uphill from the engine. Same as on the cog railway. On the cog railway, the most important job for a locomotive is not pushing, but stopping. If you don't make it up the hill, it's an annoyance. If you make it up the hill and come back down the hill very fast, you're in trouble. Yeah, so so here we've got, this is an aluminum pole that they're doing. These red gizmos, they called them polling pockets, and those used to be common on all freight cars and locomotives. That's where they'd put the pole if they wanted to push on the adjacent track. But that's something you don't see anymore. You don't see guys walking the top of the cars to set the brakes anymore either. Probably just as well. Loon Mountain. It's the cutest little narrow gauge. It runs back and forth from the parking lot to the base of the hill. Never in sunshine. It's always on the north side of the hill. The cog railway, of course. Again, the most important part about the cog railway is stopping. But notice that the slant of the boiler is much lower at the front. As they go up the hill, it'll come level. The reason they do that is they don't want all the hot water running back out of the engine into the cab. The crews really hate that. And then here's working up the hill. Last I knew, they were still running the first trip up of the hill every morning with steam. And jumping over to North Conway, this is an old Grand Trunk. It's an 060. It would have lived down in Greater Portland during its working life. They run that. And it's a cute little engine. We're up in, that's Notchland. This is Bartlett, New Hampshire. And they had this wound up pretty well. He's probably doing 30 mile an hour at that point. He was coming right along. Jumping over to the Maine Narrow Gauge Museum in Portland, Maine. This is 2 foot gauge. You can see that they laid their tracks down on the old Grand Trunk standard gauge. Look how wide the ties are for the Grand Trunk, and they're only using half of them. This is another neat outfit where you can crawl on the stuff. They run 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles, something like that, up along the waterfront. They do a great Polar Express and lots of other events. If you've got grandkids, this is close enough to do in a day, and it's neat.
The name of it that they used to have, one of those 2-foot ones that ran around a cranberry.
Oh, Edaville? Yeah. Yeah.
I think that when I was on that, it was pretty much the last year they were going to run it that way.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. He visited Edaville, which was also a 2-foot, but it was down in the cranberry bogs on Cape Cod. Some of the equipment's been scattered up through Maine, but I promised you we'd go coast to coast. This is the Atlantic Ocean behind the locomotive. Here's a shot of it coming at you. Look how narrow those rails are. This is with a long telephoto, so it's exaggerated a little. But these things aren't very big. They're not very comfortable for the crew. Crews usually spend a lot of the time at least half out of the cab.
Look at the undulation of the track on there, too.
Yeah, Maine had a lot of these 2-foot gauge railroads scattered around, and they used to run their trains about 60 mile an hour. They just go zipping on up through the woods, and I can't imagine they probably shook your fillings loose. And we are conductors impatiently waiting. Our engineer. Okay, we're going to look at one last. This is the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington. We've got, where's Bath? Bath is...
Right where your finger
Yeah, well, right there with my big label on it. Yeah, it's just up a little bit. These guys are fanatical. They're doing everything the way it would have been done at the turn of the century. No radios. They won't even use radios for parking cars when they have an event. The cars all have handbrakes. Every car has to have a brakeman when they run so that they can set the brakes. And it's a neat outfit. They are building a steam locomotive from scratch. They got one of the originals and put that back together, and they have the plans for the next one. So that is well along. I'm not quite sure how far along, but this is neat. They do a lot of neat events too. So they do lots of. Well, the most popular one I think is the Victorian Christmas. A couple of weekends before Christmas, they get reenactors in Victorian dress. And you go up and you can ride the train with all the folks in Victorian dress, and they take you up the line, and they have sleigh rides and whatnot. But another great, if you've got grandkids, it'd be another great experience. And
Say the name of that railroad again.
Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
That's why.
yeah, it is neat. This is another place where you get to walk in. First time I visited, I poked my head in the shop door to look around, and they invited me in, and 20 or 25 minutes later, the fellow that had spent 10 years restoring this engine was there giving me a lecture on how steam locomotives go together and work. And over my head, but fascinating. Here they are out on the line. They do a variety of events for photographers as well. This is another typical, the first car is dairy. It's the milk car. This would have been less than carload freight, a couple of flat cars. They've got a boiler for an engine yet to be restored. And then the coach for passengers. And got lucky with a Ford truck. A lot of the stations out in the countryside were flag stops. You could go and say you wanted to get on the train, and the station master would go out with a flag and tell the train to stop because they had to pick you up. So here we are telling the train to stop, that there are 40 photographers that want to. And while they were stopped, we made the crew, this was the director of the railroad, again at this point, we made the crew move the milk jugs around. We watched them for a couple minutes and we swore the next time we did this, we're going to fill the jugs. Yeah, they moved them a little too easily. But these guys are adding a few thousand feet of track every year. They do all volunteer. They're making great progress. It is a magical place to visit. Here they are starting up, coming up on the center is the stop in the center of the line. That was that little station. But he'd stopped, and here Engineer Bill is looking out of the cab to see if he's actually moving. Engines can slip the wheels and make a lot of noise and fury and be staying still. So he's checking to see how fast he's going. And they're coming up. And you can see the brakeman in the back here watching for signals. And there they are passing the signal down. They're telling the engineer to come ahead. Yeah, I'm going long here. I want to wrap up pretty quick. The railroad managed to survive into the 1930s with one last locomotive, and the trains ran as quick as they could fix the engine and take it up to the other end of the line and get it serviced and come back. Rarely. They eventually came down and overturned and went into the ditch, and the management came out and looked at it and said, okay, we're done. The Benjamin Moore Paint Company had a lien on their rails. They'd guaranteed a loan with the rails, so they the Benjamin Moore folks went to grab the rails to recoup their money. There were no locomotives to drive the train. So they had to hire horses, and the horses pulled flat cars. Now, the day we were up here, these guys had to pull up a section of rails so they could add a culvert. Now, you would expect that they'd wait until we disappeared and they'd take the backhoe out and pull the rails up, set them to the side, dig the ditch, put the culvert in, and put everything back. No. They got horses, took the flat car out, and they lifted the rails and put the rails on. They are fanatical. You couldn't use a backhoe in 1900. We're not doing it now. But it is a neat place to visit, and it's nice that they've got young guys volunteering for the railroad. And these guys must all be in their early 30s by now, but the railroad's going to survive with guys like this. And here's our fireman in the cab of the engine. And here's our museum director again. These are 2-foot gauge locomotives, so they're fairly tiny. Bill's a big guy, but not much bigger than I am. A couple inches taller, but that's how small the engines are. They've got the shops. That's a lathe that getting turned with a leather belt. Okay. Turntables out at the end of the line that didn't have any power to them. You had to push to turn the engine around. Railroaders, of course, called them Armstrong turntables. And here's Engineer Bob again. At the end of the day, we're in the station. He's waiting for us to get all our junk off his train and go home. And he took time to light his phone. And once again, I stopped and said, well, I don't know why we wasted the rest of the day. There's a shot. But that brings us to the caboose. You've survived. Do we have questions? I've gone real long.
What town is the East Broad Top
The East Broad Top is in Orbisonia, Pennsylvania. It's an hour and 15 minutes or so west of Carlisle. But, you know, Google East Broad Top, it'll come up.